Hey, sorry, it's been a minute. I've been on vacation, but now I'm back. I read a book before I left called A Reader's Guide to Science Fiction. It's a survey of the field written before cyberpunk happened. It was published in 1979. It had 3 different authors, and they went author by author in science fiction, spanning whatever, its whole history until that point, giving a little CV of each person. One of the authors loved spoilers. That was his thing. That's why he got into academia. That's why he wrote the book. I'm going to set out to spoil every single book that I mention while also panning it. I realized reading through all those authors and a couple little brief historical essays that up until that point in history, I feel like I pretty much have the broad strokes of the picture. There weren't that many people that were talked about in there that I hadn't at least heard of. I certainly haven't read all of them. So it made me feel like I do have my sea legs in the genre now, and I kind of know what I'm looking at when I look at stuff. Oh, God. Very, very large dog. Who does not like vloggers. Got my fill of this scenario over in Southeast Asia. Got chased by a pack of dogs for a video that I ended up actually not publishing. The darlings that you have to kill in doing this. Let's see if the Rottweiler comes over here and murders me. There's a smaller dog as well, a boxer. This is an Andy Weir reader, I think. Hi, buddy. Hi, little guy. Hi, little guy. Please not to attack. Please not to attack. Hi. 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 You are small and intense. All right, survival horror, book vlogging. All right, we made it. Hey, you know what travel taught me is that cats are better than dogs. I know that's a thing that people say to be whatever, like edgy at dinner parties, but it's really my take. I like dogs. I love cats. I went from loving dogs to liking dogs after being chased by about a dozen of them. Just lost half of my subscribers. Okay, we were talking about something. There were a few authors in there that I hadn't really heard of that sounded really interesting, and you could tell the interesting ones because the authors would go out of their minds saying, this person is interesting. This is a big exception from this rule of really drab space opera. All those authors really blended together, and there's very little of that part of the genre that captured my attention, and I feel like I am at home on the fringes amongst the weirdos. The 2 weirdos that stand out in memory most vividly, that made me curious to read them, that I haven't read yet, that I was kind of aware of, but bumped them up in the ranking, Angela Carter and John Sladek. I have acquired books from both of them. In fact, I went on the line, as my former landlady used to refer to the internet as going on the line. So I went on the line and I ordered a bunch of books, including Angela Carter and John Sladek. So I'm going to be reading them pretty soon. It's an interesting read. I don't think it's certainly complete. It's certainly not contemporaneous with the field now because it was written in 1979, but it's a neat time capsule. Then I read a really interesting book called Soviet Science Fiction that was curated and edited by Isaac Asimov, published in 1962, if memory serves. The most interesting part of the book is actually Asimov's introductory essay, where he talks about Soviet science fiction as it was in the early 60s as a nascent part of literature. That's how he portrayed it, at least. I'm not an expert in Soviet SF history, and I would like to read more about it because it's acutely interesting. But he pitches it basically as there was a freeze out of the import of American science fiction material from the pulp magazines until the years preceding the publication of that book. And so the Soviet authors would ape American pulp style. There's an enduring rumor, I guess, or speculation that Asimov was a Marxist. I would assume that he at least had flirtations with ideas of socialism, and he was a member of the Futurians, and some people have said that the Foundation stories are like Marxist allegories for dialectical materialism. So Asimov may have been a fellow traveler. I don't know. I'm not totally sure. But there's not a lot in the stories to travel with. They're hilariously dry, academic, and Asimovian pieces of hard SF writing for the most part, with the exception of the first story that's really a novella written by Belyaev, a man referred to as the Soviet Jules Verne or the Russian Jules Verne, someone that I really knew nothing about. He wasn't in, I don't think any of the Soviet authors except for the Strugatskys were in that history book that I just talked about. But Belyaev, someone that just never, ever gets discussed, and it was an interesting story about implanting a human brain into an elephant body. Wasn't exactly high literature, but it was pretty interesting, and actually, even though it was the oldest and the campiest, was the most sort of perpendicular to the kind of values that you typically find in American pulp science fiction and fantasy writing. It was expressly anti-racist, anti-colonialist, and it was a fun little adventure yarn, and I have ordered at least one other just one other Belyaev book that seems pretty rare that I'll be reading and reviewing. There's also a Strugatsky story in there, but it's from pretty early on. It is interesting in that it deals with worries over artificial intelligence. It's not their best work. It's not very Strugatskyan, but it at least holds together as a short story. The rest of the material sucks pretty bad, and I would skip it. It's a beautiful book aesthetically, and it's a pleasure to read, and the Asimov introduction is really good. I actually would love to read some Asimov essays. Actually, last night I read his review of 1984 that is hilariously scathing and misses on a couple of marks, but I think is pretty dead on the money in certain ways. And he was a great essayist, and I just haven't read that much of his nonfiction. And I actually think, correct me if I'm wrong, you always do. I think Asimov wrote more nonfiction than fiction. The book is not great. I would say pick it up and read the intro and those first two stories if you do find it, but I wouldn't seek it out. And then I read banger of bangers, Unsleeping Eye by D.G. Compton, which is the alternate title of the continuous Katherine Mortenhoe. He's the guy that wrote Farewell, Earth's Bliss, a book that made it onto the last Top 15 video. And my God, what a masterpiece. It's better than that one. It's better than Farewell, Earth's Bliss. It's more subtle. It's very, let's see how many times I can say this phrase, Ballardian. It has Ballard's skepticism of technology. It has Ballard's eye for alienation, but it doesn't have Ballard's deep, biting, aggressive pessimism about the inherent brutality of human nature. That part is missing, and I have to say that's the only part of Ballard that I don't really like. Ballard's hyper-Freudian vision of the world as wild animals just poised on the cusp of ripping each other limb from limb, I think is at its heart kind of a conservative way to see the world, and I personally don't fully resonate with it. Compton has a softer touch. It's a softer sort of dystopian vision of a near future, and it gets so much right, both in terms of how the book is written and its purview, the way that it sees the world and the way that it predicts the world. And this isn't usually something that I care that much about, the predictive genius of science fiction authors. I think a lot of it is just random chance. When you see, for instance, a cell phone in an old science fiction book from the 50s, they came up with so many of these little tchotchkes and little thought experiments that of course some of them would pan out to be correct. But for an author to have this instinct, this anthropological instinct, this cultural instinct of being able to forecast things that are right on the horizon, I think is impressive and worthy of praise, and this is what Compton does here. He foresees the advent of reality television, and more broadly, the way our private lives are commodified for public consumption, or the way we now are willing to self-commodify even in our darkest moments and our most acute sufferings, like Katherine Mortenhoe, the protagonist, who's a middle-aged woman, I think in her mid-40s, if I remember correctly, who is diagnosed with a terminal illness that is a consequence. It's very like PKD, Ian. She has brain rot from overstimulation from the media, and it will disorder her thinking and rearrange her neurology until she collapses and dies. And she is selected by an executive at a media company to be the subject of this hyper-popular television show that follows around the terminally ill to document their final moments and their private sufferings. And it's a huge hit and huge moneymaker. And she's resistant and disgusted by their pitches. And the other main character is a journalist who's replaced his eyeballs with cameras that are always filming and broadcasting back to the media HQ. And this is the new way that they're going to film this TV show without the knowledge or really the consent of the filmed. And he sees it as this great watershed moment in the history of journalism where finally you can get the unalloyed look at the subject without them being aware that they're being recorded and without their intervening levels of self-censorship or performance. The writing is gorgeous, especially the first couple chapters. One of the best opening passages of any book ever. It could live alone as a little novella. Just like with Farewell, Earth's Bliss, I have a little couple tiny quibbles with some of the world building, but oh well. It's around 10 out of 10 status. It's like 9, 10. He's such a nimble author too. He's so adept at marrying his subject matter with his style. There's a thing that he does with the POV where Katherine Mortenhoe is narrated in third person and this guy, even though he's not technically the protagonist, is narrated from first person. It's just genius. It's a genius book. Ballardian. I then read a book by a man named Kenneth Patchen, who is probably the most important writer in my life as a reader. I ran into a book of his poetry called Selected Poems when I was in my early teen years, probably 13, 14, 15, around there. Found it at a used bookstore, pulled it off the shelf, and read a couple of the poems and resisted buying it because I felt such a pull from it. It was like being dragged down this slope into high literature, and I didn't really want to do it. And eventually I didn't do it. Ultimately, I didn't follow through on becoming a poetry reader in a serious way, for better or for worse, probably for worse. But I had this really, really intense relationship with this book of poetry when I was a teen that I think probably more than anything was influential on the formation of my personality and my ethics. I've gone back to him a couple of times after that first run, where I also read his novel, one of his novels called The Journal of Albion Moonlight. That's a surrealist, experimental piece of fiction, anti-war fiction. But this is the first time I've gone back to him in probably over a decade. He's an obscurity, but he casts a long shadow. He's one of the forerunners of beat poetry along with Kenneth Rexroth. Imagine if Kerouac and Ginsberg were really, really angry and really, really not into Buddhism. That would be Kenneth Patchen. I prefer him to both of those authors. I prefer him to all the beat poets. He was also an artist. He did these weird surrealistic paintings that I don't like as much. Patchen is most well known for his pacifism, which is, I think, one of the reasons why he remained so obscure over the course of his life. He also had a spinal injury that incapacitated him and kept him in chronic pain. He did get a moment in the sun in the 1960s amidst the Vietnam War protests because of his his pacifism, which is the character that infuses most of his work. Most of his work lives in this continuum of, I would almost call a mythos that depicts the world as having fallen from some kind of inherent, like, Rousseauian, noble, savage grace, and that the world is at an end, that the world has been despoiled and destroyed by war and profiteering, and that we're at the end of history. And imagery of animals and these like Edenic nature scenes and of angels recur constantly in his writing. His stuff moves me in a way, and maybe it's because of my history with him, because it touches on, you know, nostalgia, but nobody moves me like Patchen. You know, no, there's not another writer, even though he's not like the best writer, there's not another writer that makes me feel the way Patchen feels, or as intensely as Patchen makes me feel. And it almost is uncomfortable to recommend Patchen because he's so important to me personally, and he feels like my private author. He feels like he's my guy. But it's criminal that he's as underrated as he is and as unknown as he is, especially considering the amount of influence that he held over American culture. In terms of this particular title, I loved it, but I think that his poetry is better than his prose work, like his prose poetry, which is what this is. I would like to read more of his proper fiction, reread Journal of Albion Moonlight, and there's another title, Memoirs of a Shy Pornographer, that I would like to read. He produced a big body of work. I think he's published 30 or 40 books. I would start with the poetry. I would start with Selected Poems, which was written, published in 1946, I believe. Probably the most important book to me ever. I've got a bunch more videos coming down the pipe. I'm going to be doing a top 5 best books that I've read this year and top worst books that I've read this year, and a bunch of haul videos. And I guess I will commit myself to this now. I want to do the top fantasy book list video. Probably going to be a top 10 because I haven't read quite enough to make 15 feel like it's really narrowing it down adequately. But I want to actually do the top fantasy video. So stay tuned, and more stuff on the Patreon if you're a nasty little freak and you just need more. Thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.